Next, we are joined by Aaron Helgeson from Montclair State University in New Jersey. Are you ready to go?
I am, yeah.
Okay, terrific.
I'm a little tall, so I'm going to raise the microphone here. I'm going to be a little bit different and not really talk about my teaching, more talk about my experience as a composer and how that's informed a lot of my more recent work with students, and just a kind of framework for thinking about creativity and largely mental health. So in 2002, as an undergraduate at a major music conservatory, my composition teacher told his students if we didn't have anything written before our weekly lessons, we shouldn't bother showing up. And at the time, that seemed reasonable, right? What would we talk about if we didn't have anything new to show? And I think this is a pretty common statement to get from composition teachers, unfortunately. And so all of us started taking for granted that outside of that 1 hour, what we did during the week was our own business and responsibility, and we shouldn't bother our teacher about it. I wish I could say that that was an isolated event to that person or that conservatory, but throughout my career at graduate school and at other institutions, I found composition teachers throughout the country who stigmatize a lack of progress that's judged for the most part by a maintained quantity of notation or of audio. And so because of that stigma, I couldn't see the truth. This is moving around here. A truth that I'd only come to learn after several depressive episodes, a decade of psychotherapy, and candid discussions with my creative colleagues, friends, and students. If you want to read more about that, I've written a piece elsewhere. I won't go into that whole narrative right now. But that truth, the not having produced anything, is actually a very common and composerly problem to have. One that our formal training gives us almost no way to even diagnose, let alone solve. With the right tools, it's a problem that can help us see what to do next. And without those tools, we inevitably get trapped in patterns that are at best unproductive and at worst psychologically disabling. In fact, very few composition programs in the US directly address the creative process itself: workflow, workspace, management of mental and emotional states, divergent thinking, choosing instead to focus their pedagogy exclusively on musical critique, score study, and development of craft. At the same time, research shows that creative skills mostly atrophy by the age when students usually begin their composition studies. And I realize now I'm actually not playing this, so I'll go ahead and do that. Okay. An American longitudinal study published in 1992 by psychologists George Land and Beth Jarman measured the creative skills of 1,600 children throughout their education using the standard Torrance tools of creativity test. Land and Jarman tested the subject group with a whole battery of creative tasks every 5 years or so, tabulating scores against what Torrance defined as a genius level of creativity. I won't get into the problematics of that right now. And finding that although a shocking 98% of the children met that level of divergent thinking at ages 3 to 5, in the exact same group of children, those numbers dropped sharply as they progressed through their education, to 32% at ages 8 to 10, 10% at ages 13 to 15, with a controlled group of adults performing at only 2%. What does that say about creativity? That like athletics, many of us already have these skills at a young age, and if we continue to exercise those abilities, we'll maintain them. If not, they'll fade. And it looks like they fade before most musicians start their creative training. So how can we address this creativity gap in a composition curriculum? How do we rehabilitate these skills at the beginning of someone's creative life to avoid harmful cycles? First, we have to understand what creativity looks like as a process. In her book, Your Creative Brain, Harvard cognitive scientist Shelley Carson describes 7 distinct modalities of the creative process. She gives an acronym to these modes, CREATES, that puts a name to each of them. Connect, reason, envision, absorb, transform, evaluate, and stream. These 7 different brain sets are all synthesized from recent research in the psychology and neuroscience of creativity, like a 2004 study that used PET scans to measure brain activity while creating a story using a prefabricated list of 16 words from different parts of speech, or a 2007 study employing MRI imaging that compared brain activity during improvisation with performing the same improvisation from memory. Of course, it's not the names or the order of these states that's important, it's the ways they're distinct from each other. Carson defines connect as a defocused state of attention that allows you to see the connections between objects or concepts. And it involves parts of the brain that deal with a lot of different kinds of sensory information, like language, music, vision, memory, motivation, and reward. What's interesting here is the pattern recognition center in the prefrontal cortex, where most of our internal dialogue happens, on the left side of the brain is inhibited. So the associations you're making in Connect are more automatic, more reliant on iconic and emotional memory than finding patterns, and less consciously thought out. Reason, on the other hand, is conscious manipulation of information in your working memory to solve a problem. This is almost a mirror of the Connect brain set, and I mean that in a literal sense, since the more active area is on the opposite side of the brain. Connect stressed memory retrieval, association, and combining information. Reason stresses pattern recognition and learned behavior. You're accessing all the stuff you already know from the things you're thinking about. And vision is mental manipulation of visual, aural, and kinesthetic objects or concepts that have been transformed into objects, and we'll get into what transform means in a second. Basically, it puts connect and reason together and adds a little bit of inhibition to the memory and analysis centers of the brain. So it's really just about generating and then analyzing internal sensory stimulation. A lot of the time, we call that imagination, and that compares pretty well to the envision mode. Absorb is uncritically sensing the world and taking in knowledge. You'll notice that the brain patterns here are almost exactly the same as in vision. That makes sense, since we're focusing on perception here too. But the difference is there's slightly less emphasis on analysis and more on sensation and recognition. Transform is converting one object, concept, feeling, or action into another from a different domain through association and metaphor. What's significant is that transform really engages the amygdala, the part of the brain involved in retrieval of emotional memory, meaning our ability to mentally change one thing to something else depends a lot on our affective associations. Evaluate is consciously judging the value of ideas, concepts, objects, behaviors, or individuals. Here, it's all about that prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that produces conscious thought. Just as important, though, is the cingulate cortex that regulates emotional states, mostly by inhibiting them. Why would that be active here? What's going on is that the kinds of psychological reward we get from finding any solution to a problem, are suppressed until we find the right solution. As we'll see in a sec, this has big implications for the ways that connect and evaluate are different from each other. Finally, stream is allowing thoughts and actions to flow freely without judgment. One important thing to notice here is that the analysis centers in the prefrontal cortex and right parietal lobe are completely inactive. So the language, memory, and motivation centers take the driver's seat without really checking on what you've already done. So this is really the opposite of evaluation. Where before we were turning down the reward centers, now we're cranking them way up. So now we've gone through the distinctions between each of these 7 modes. I'm going to put them into a hierarchy, and this is mine, not Shelley Carson's, that'll be useful for putting them into a compositional context. Ta-da! Okay, so let's organize these modes in a few different ways. We'll start with the continuum from passive to active. What do I mean by active? I mean that these are categories of creative activity that require lots of conscious thought, as opposed to unconscious or subconscious processes like sensing and feeling. If you want, in neuroanatomy terms, the more active modes show more activity in the prefrontal cortex, and the more passive modes show more brain processing in the feeling and sensing areas further down that don't involve the kind of thinking to ourselves you get in the cortex. And so modes like connect and evaluate are the most active because they use the greatest amount of conscious thought. And modes like absorb and stream are the most passive because they're more sensing and feeling processes. Another continuum that we can think about, scroll down presenter notes, is one that starts in the center with a non-judgmental creative mode and moves outward toward judgmental modes. Absorb has no activity at all in the inhibition centers of the brain, and so by nature, it's non-judgmental. And if we go to the other extremes, connect and evaluate are all about judging whether a thought is useful or not. Okay, so 2 more continuum before we take a sec to look at specific applications. One is convergent thinking, and one is divergent thinking. The simplest way of talking about this is that convergent thinking is all about finding one single best solution to a problem. You start by thinking up or envisioning that solution, then you reason out all the different aspects of the solution, and then you evaluate it to see if it's right. And if it's not, you go all the way back to the beginning and envision another solution. And you keep on doing that until you find the one right chef's kiss solution, right? The perfect thing. Divergent thinking is totally different. The goal is not to find the one solution, is to find as many as possible all at once, so someone else, maybe literally someone else, or maybe just you in a different day, can evaluate them later. One of these tests that cognitive scientists use to measure divergent thinking is something called the title test. It's basically the New Yorker caption contest where they show an image and you have to come up with as many titles for it as you can in 1 minute. It's actually pretty hard because we're used to evaluating things right when we think of them. We feel like it has to be funny, or we feel like we have to describe every single thing in the image, when really the experimenters don't care about how good the titles are. They just count how many you come up with. So now that we have a rough grasp on these creative modes, how they're distinct and how we can categorize them, I want to look at a couple different workflows we can create out of them and the problems we encounter when we get stuck in those workflows. I'll start with what most of us think composing is when we start out. And here's a workflow for the classic Hollywood image from Amadeus or A Motor Beloved, where there's like a white male genius composer alone in a room at the piano, inspired by their imagination, channeling sound through their fingers into the keyboard, hurrying to write things down as quickly as possible, crossing out big chunks until finally there's that perfect symphony at the end. Okay, yeah, like I'm joking, but let's think about this in terms of something most of us can identify with. Let's take figuring out chords. So the first thing is we envision chords we like by imagining them, maybe as a fully voiced harmony, or maybe a general quality like major or diminished, or modally like a jazz improviser might, or we just imagine the chord's general sonic affect. Then we transform what we just imagined into sound played on the piano, or we transform the sound we imagined or the image of the keys on the keyboard into music notation on a page or a screen. Then we start to reason out what the order of these chords could be or how many of them we need. And we evaluate them by judging the chords themselves, their order or their quantity. And so we have a feedback loop. 5 minutes, thanks. I'll rush through this, guys. This is like condensed down from a 60-minute talk, so I'm rushing through it. That's why I have the script. I don't usually. Now remember, this doesn't necessarily happen in a step-by-step sequence. In reality, we're shifting back and forth super quickly between all these modes, maybe even the span of a few seconds. But what happens if we sit down to work that day and for whatever reason you can't get your imagination going? Maybe someone's distracting you by practicing harp in the next room, or you just had a loss in your family, or, and this one's very common, you just aren't feeling confident in what you're imagining, and so your brain starts inhibiting those envisioned firing patterns. Then we start to transform, right? Because we don't have anything to transform. Oops. I'll quickly go through this. Here we go. Okay, we lose envision. Now we're just left with transform, reason, and evaluate. But since there's no imaginative imagery to transform, that quickly goes away. Now we're just cycling through reason and evaluate. Psychologists call this rumination, which is a recurrent pattern that tends to surround the same topic. The neuroscientist Moshe Bar, in his book Mind Wandering, talks about what can happen to ruminations if they start becoming frequent and persistent. When your mind wanders, you continue cycling through these two brain states. But those ruminative thoughts start to grow out into bigger and bigger thoughts. And because that evaluate mode's whole purpose is to inhibit things, those bigger and bigger thoughts are usually going to be negative. So let's look at an example. Here's a thought that might come up while you're working on some music. Are these chords good? It's a super common and reasonable question to ask while you're evaluating your musical materials. But say you keep thinking about it for a long time. You try to think of new chords. You don't like any of them, so you get stuck, and it derails your work session and you stop. Then when you go to work again, you start with that same question, but you still can't come up with anything, and so your mind starts wandering to bigger evaluative thoughts. Is any of this music good? Will people like this music? Will it advance my career? Am I good enough to be a composer? And eventually you start going through the series of questions over and over every time you sit down to work. And what happens then? You start to develop anxiety. You're worried you're never going to get out of this loop of negative thinking, and so you start avoiding composing altogether. Okay? And then it gets worse. You apply to a competition, and you don't win. And now it's different because something just happened that makes all of those no answers become real. Your internal feelings of inadequacy and shame about yourself are reinforced externally out there in the world, and it confirms all the negative thoughts you've been thinking. And so all this rumination finally leads to anxiety's evil twin, depression. Andrew Solomon, in his really great book on depression called The Noonday Demon, says that depression is despair about the past, and anxiety is despair about the future. So if you cry uncontrollably and lay in bed for hours after a difficult breakup, maybe you're just grieving, right? But if you cry uncontrollably and lay in bed for hours when you can't figure out what to write next, you might be having symptoms of depression. Here are some of the most common symptoms psychologists talk about in clinical depression and anxiety. And you'll notice that several of these look a lot like things we commonly encounter while composing. Am I one behind? There we go. It's important to recognize these things in ourselves and in our students so that we can make sure the mental and emotional support is there from friends and from mental health professionals. But also we want to help students break out of these cycles. So what do? Let's go back to the modes that we had originally. Here's where we got stuck. Now remember that chart we were looking at? Evaluate and reason are the most judgmental ways of working, and then the most convergent. So you're trying to find one right answer, and if you don't find it, you've failed. So how do we get out of that pattern? First, stop, and already I feel better. Okay, but we're going to have to keep working, otherwise we'll never finish. So what do? We turn to ways of working that are less judgmental and more divergent. To absorb and stream. No evaluating, no wrong answers, no ruminating about the past or the future, just freely experiencing and playing without limits. So for absorb, I might listen to other people's music. I might perform some mindfulness meditation or put some background white noise. For stream, I improvise. Journal, which honestly usually looks more like me typing things into Wikipedia and kind of going down that rabbit hole, or talking with someone and sharing what we're working on. So this can be a really helpful feedback loop. And if we keep going on this divergent path, we can make all sorts of connections between those thoughts and ideas. But the thing is, this creative cycle can also bring up problems. Sometimes instead of working with the ideas we've already created, we just keep seeking new ones. And this starts to look like another familiar mental cycle. Attention deficit. Basically what happens to your brain chemistry in ADHD is you get an extra hit of norepinephrine, which increases the rate and amount of activity going on in the brain and body, and an extra hit of dopamine, which gives you an even greater feeling of reward when you experience things you like, and then that motivates an increase in reward-seeking behavior. If we look at the medical symptoms of attention deficit, we're again going to see some things in common with parts of the creative process. So how do we get out of that cycle? First, we have to take this feedback loop between absorb and stream and disconnect it. But we're going to take these ideas and thoughts we produced and hook them up to transform by doing things like recording those improvisations, transcribing those recordings, or coding things that'll produce similar results. Then we're going to pivot back to convergent cycles we were in earlier by reasoning what to do next, evaluating those results, etc. And what I'm getting at is that an emotional and mentally healthy workflow, and hopefully one that sustains productivity in whatever form that takes, is one that's constantly and rapidly flowing between all of these modalities and creativity. Ultimately, a composer's instrument is their mind. We use our mind for lots of other things, and when it's not working, we can't just replace its parts. Our job as teachers is to understand the creative process and the mental states it flows through, and how to help our students, others, and ourselves develop as many methods as possible to address them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We have a few minutes.
Hi. Yes. Hi, I'm Frank. I teach at Wichita State University. Thank you so much for caring so much about your students to do this work. I just really inspiring. So as I said, I teach at Wichita State University. I wrote this down during your presentation. I was paying attention. I just wanted to say this right. So, the children of working class families are under life and death pressure to not do divergent thinking. So how do we say what creativity is and isn't? Especially for my students at Wichita State University.
So Ken Robinson, who is an education specialist who passed away several years ago, he defined creativity as the process of coming up with original ideas that have value. I kind of like that definition because it's fairly flexible and doesn't make it discipline specific. And I think a lot about what Ian was talking about, where we're teaching people to be creative. We're not necessarily teaching people to become professional composers or teachers of composition. So I think that's important in addressing that question. I also think about this idea of artistic voice that Joseph was talking about, where I like to think of that as a confrontation between desire, training, and life circumstances. And I think there's a lot to be said for developing narratives about yourself and your life, and that can be very empowering and make you realize, okay, here's what I want to be able to make in my life. Whether that's creative work like this, like a composition, or creative work like just crafting your life and crafting friendships. And so when I refer to creativity, I'm not necessarily just referring to kind of artistic creativity. And I think that's really important to keep considering when we think about teaching populations. I just focus on composing because this is a composition pedagogy conference.
Can I ask just one follow-up, like a practical thing? What if somebody writes an art song and it's 1-4-5 the whole way through, and it's all a diatonic scale in the voice? Do you tell them that that's not creative, or?
Oh, no. No. When I'm working with students, I define composition as the process of gaining awareness of music that didn't previously exist and finding ways of sharing that with other people. I don't want to get into... I think there's a place and time for thinking about what is valuable and what's not valuable and what's impactful, to use Ian's term, and what's not impactful, and to who. And I think those are important questions to ask. But I think we need to recognize now that the field that we're in, which is making music, manifests itself in all sorts of different ways, and that it's not going to be useful for us as teachers to define what the ultimate product is. I guess what I'm getting at here is commit to a process. Yeah. Find a process that's relevant to you and commit to that, and then the product will flow from that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Alyssa. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern, and as a PhD student, I'm also a teacher. So I've had students confide in me their own experiences of depression, and where that's become complicated is, one, I'm a mandated reporter, and two, I'm not a mental health specialist, and as much as I can help, I feel the responsibility of poorly addressing the issue. So I'm curious if you have any examples of how you've implemented this in your own teaching with students who are dealing with mental health issues, and how you manage that balance.
Yeah. First of all, we're not, as composition teachers, mental health professionals. And so the first thing you want to do when you observe symptoms of depression or anxiety, you're not going to diagnose it, right? Is find some resources for them. Just suggest if we're teaching in higher ed, most campuses now have counseling services and therapy services, which is a really great thing to take advantage of. So you're not responsible for the mental health piece, but I think we need to start being more responsible about how the compositional process and all of the mental and emotional things that come up around that, how that can either contribute to a depression or aggravate it if it's already happening. And so I think your question was specifically to students who are struggling with mental health challenges like depression and anxiety and all of that. I think just up front, the important thing to acknowledge is come in to your lesson or your meeting or whatever it is, no matter what you have, because the problem of being a composer or a creative person of whatever vocation is how to make something, and that's inevitably going to bring blocks. It's inevitably going to bring moments where you can't find yourself working. And generally, what I'll do, look, psychology and psychotherapy have figured out a lot of great solutions for this already, and so we should rely on those solutions, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, where you're charting out what you do, when, and how you're feeling about it, and all of that, and you start to try and make changes. And so one of the things that I'll do with students is I'll have them bring in photos of their workspace, wherever that is. We'll try and adjust their workspace. I have them talk about when they're working, how long they're working, and we'll try and make adjustments to that if possible. And it's really student-centered because everybody's different. We're not all morning people or night people. We don't have access, we don't all have access to the same resources. So how can you maximize the resources that you have to still create, but to also be mindful of your own mental and emotional health? We have a noontime concert, so I think we have time for only one. Nope. I think, yeah.
Just real briefly, I wanted to add, at my university, what I found is that my colleagues were dealing with mental health issues. And, no, I'm not joking. And often exacerbated by having to manage students with mental health issues. And so what I did was I started like a grassroots luncheon once a month for us, just to share stories and strategies, because we're not experts, but out of that's come a whole thing, you know? So if you don't have that where you are, I would suggest you seek out allies, maybe not even where you are if you don't have them in other places, because to me, this is the growth area right now in education, is dealing with mental health and cognitive issues just all around. So just want to thank you for raising it up in this space.
Yeah. I will say that I think a lot of the problems that come up with this come from the fact that we tend to think of creative and specifically compositional activity as something we do alone. And I think, just like it sounds like you found, that finding ways of engaging a group with your own individual process is really helpful and very healing. So I highly, highly recommend that. When I started doing that for myself, it really changed everything. Changed everything for me. So thank you.